Hello and welcome to my video all about how to create a twisted slip stitch selvage. This is a technique you can use on any flat knitting project to make your selvages smoother and neater. And in case you're wondering what selvages are, they're the side edges of your knitting. During this tutorial I'll be demonstrating this selvage on garter stitch as well as stockinette stitch. As you can see, I've already cast on some stitches and done a few rows of garter stitch. Garter stitch is of course made up of only knit stitches, and you can see the edges are quite bumpy. Okay, so to add this selvage you only need to change the first and last stitches of every row, and the first stitch on every row is a slip stitch. More specifically, we're going to slip one knitwise with the yarn in back. To do this, make sure that the working yarn is at the back behind the needles. Then take your right hand needle up through the next stitch as if to knit, but instead of knitting it, you just slip it off the end of the needle. The difference between slipping a stitch purlwise or slipping a stitch knitwise is that when you do it knitwise, you're actually twisting the stitch. And that's why this method is called the twisted slip stitch selvage. Because this selvage method only involves the first and last stitch of every row, you can do any pattern you like in between them. Because I'm doing garter stitch, I'm now going to do knit stitches until I reach the very last stitch. And then you bring the working yarn between the needles to the front in order to purl the last stitch. And that's it, that's all there is to it. So to recap, on every row you begin by slipping a stitch knitwise with the yarn in back, and you finish with a purl stitch. I then knitted a few more rows using this method so that you can get a good comparison. If you take a closer look now, you should be able to see the obvious difference between the regular garter stitch edges and the twisted slip stitch edges that we've added. You can see that the garter stitch edges are all bumpy, whilst the slip stitch edges are a lot smoother and have a twisted chain effect. I'm now going to demonstrate the same process but on stockinette stitch. So I begin by slipping a stitch knitwise with the yarn in back. Then, because I'm doing stockinette stitch, I'm just going to do knit stitches until I get to the very last stitch. Then I bring the working yarn to the front and I do a purl stitch. Then on the wrong side rows of stockinette stitch I would do the same method, so I would begin by slipping a stitch knitwise with the yarn in back. But because I'm doing stockinette stitch, I would then do purl stitches until the very last stitch. And then of course I would finish with a purl stitch. And here is the result after I do a few more rows. If we take a closer look, you can see that the regular stockinette stitch edges are actually fairly similar to the slip stitch selvages. They both have that kind of chain effect, however the biggest difference is that the slip stitches are longer. This just gives these selvages a more attractive, smoother appearance. As a side note, since this method involves 2 stitches, I would advise adding 2 extra stitches to your pattern. So for instance, if you're following a pattern for a garter stitch scarf and it tells you to cast on 40 stitches, I would recommend casting on 42 stitches instead. This way the selvages are added onto your pattern and don't interfere with the original pattern at all. And that's it, that's how you do the twisted slip stitch selvage. I really hope you found this useful and thank you very much for watching.